Is there a moment where you reconsidered continuing or pivoting your creative practice?
Hell yeah, of course. What?
Yes, there were many, many moments where I reconsidered my career.
I almost quit so many times.
There's definitely a defining moment in my own creative practice that I remember refusing to participate in mainstream forms of art, basically. I've been painting my whole life. I've been creative my whole life. When I was in my early 20s, I kind of was naive about interacting with like the Western art world. But I quickly learned how that space is not for me. That space doesn't properly care for my artwork. That space doesn't properly care for my communities. Those spaces often don't even reach my communities. So I remember a defining moment of being like, why am I even trying to fit within this weird world? Like, I'm just gonna turn away from that and I'm just going to create the conditions to share my own work in ways that actually honor who I am and honor what I'm trying to do. To navigate that was pretty scary because we all feel the pressure to, have a career, have a successful blah, 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 or whatever. So I remember like grappling with that, like, I'm not gonna be able to make money off my artwork. I'm not going to reach people, like you feel all these different pressures, but ultimately, I just said whatever and began kind of like showing my artwork through my social media and really just finding my own validation through what my work means to me. So I do a lot of, I gift a lot of my paintings. I use them to like heal and tell my story. And so just really holding on to that and letting go of all the weird pressures that exist and realizing I can kind of create the own space for me to show my work in ways that align with who I am.
I almost quit a few times a year, at least. I was for a long time unfunded, so I spent about 3 years with an Indigenous community doing work to resist the Coastal GasLink pipeline. I did that without receiving academic funding. I lived out of my car. I lived in a canvas tent. I lived in a tiny trailer. It was difficult to really center the intellectual work that I was attempting to do when I first started that project. And so I stopped centering it. I really refocused what I was doing on the needs of the community that I was working with.
When we're looking at it, we're really seeing that most of the pivots are happening to us, right? Because of the structural conditions that are around us. The hustle, the scarcity mentality and the scarcity conditions that are manufactured, particularly in arts and cultural spaces, really created unsurvivable material realities for a lot of artists, particularly those of them who share intersections such as mine. And there's so many of us who are quote unquote successful and or known, who have lived for the majority of our if not all of our art lives as artists and cultural producers on or below the poverty line, particularly when we live in large urban centers like Toronto. That, as well as like the pressure to commodify your cultural production in a way that can be turned into a quote unquote product. This idea that you should try to monetize your creative practice in the same way that you would, something in a manufacturing process, and that feels really anxiety inducing. And so there are definitely aspects of my practice that I explore and engage with that are very different than the things that I do. And that's dabbling in textile art, for example, where a lot of the times people will see the end product and say, wow, you should sell that. And I'm like, no, I don't want to sell that. I want to have a creative discipline that isn't so tied to the food in my belly and the roof over my head, so that I can actually explore the thing I want to explore and not be responding to the capitalist pressure of it all. So the notion that you need to have mass appeal or sell to a broad audience, by its nature, excludes people who have been excluded from a definition of a broad audience, who are always seen as essentialist or culturally specific, or like they're not going to have mass appeal, or they're never going to have an audience. So that is a lot of pressure, and I just did not want to deal with that. So that definitely led to pivots or turns or tangents in my career.
There were many, many moments where I reconsidered my career, especially my journalism career. And the biggest issue there was that lack of representation, was the lack of awareness of Indigenous history and of Indigenous communities. And I came up against that on a regular basis, working in a mainstream Canadian newsroom. Oftentimes I was the only Indigenous person working in that newsroom, so I would be relied on for providing context, for providing contacts for particular stories, and just for being that token representation in some ways. You know, I was very frustrated often with how CBC lacked proper representation, how it wasn't actually diverse, it wasn't actually reflective of Canadian demographic dynamics. And I was frustrated with how CBC failed to retain young Indigenous journalists, especially. You know, young Indigenous journalists didn't feel it was a place for them. They felt often tokenized, they felt exploited for their skills and for their contacts, and they didn't feel at home, so they left altogether. And I did my best to encourage people to stay with it, even though it didn't always work, even though a lot of people left far earlier than they should have. You know, they were pushed out by a hostile industry, by an organization that was at its core hostile, even if it didn't realize it. And people, Indigenous people especially, didn't feel at home there, and they gave up on their dreams, they gave up on their careers. So I was frustrated often when that happened, and I considered leaving. But what pulled me through were the stories that people shared with me out in the community. You know, the people who turned to me to get their stories out there on CBC.
The main pivot point for me in my work was during the period of time where I was supposed to be doing my dissertation field work. I had spent a couple of months on my home territory in the Yukon, and while I was up there, my friend and mentor, Brian Grandboy, contacted me to let me know that he was dying of cancer. And he asked me to come and spend time with him and record his life story. Brian was also a land defender, he was a warrior, he was a strong Dene man who spent decades and decades on the front lines of Indigenous land defense, supported the movements happening at Oka, Gustafson Lake, many other Indigenous movements for autonomy and sovereignty across Turtle Island. And so when he asked me to come and record his story, of course I said yes, and I really just dropped everything else. I went on a leave of absence from my program, and I spent several months with him listening to his story and recording it, and that project will eventually result in a book, a biography that will cover his life and work, and also the history of Indigenous organizing over the last few decades. It's really an expansive amount of experience that he had. That project and the sense of urgency that came from that, and learning more about his life and the reasons why he did what he did throughout his life, really changed things for me. I really started to think about why we're doing what we're doing. I started to think about how important that knowledge passed down from our elders is for the way that we hold ourselves today. I started to think about all of the relations that really need care and nurturing, that aren't served by an academic model that aims to come in and extract knowledge from communities and then leave. My anxiety about what I was going to do for my dissertation really floated away at that point. I wasn't so interested in how this was going to serve my own personal career or not. And so I think that was the biggest pivot point that I came to. And when I returned to what was going to be my research site, it was to support the Wet'suwet'en people in resisting pipeline construction after the successful application that the Coastal GasLink Pipeline Company made for an injunction to gain access without Indigenous consent to Wet'suwet'en territory to begin pipeline construction. So at that point, I threw all of my writing and research skills behind the movement to start to resist that pipeline project. So yeah, that became my main focus, was how could I support this resistance? How can I help get the word out about what was happening on Wet'suwet'en territory? How can we, as people who have institutional forms of privilege, manage and harness resources to be redistributed to frontline communities that are facing down these projects? That's how I ended up spending most of my time on Wet'suwet'en territory, and that's how I ended up behind a blockade, taking an interview for my current job, my current position.